Join us on an investigative journey as we educate each other on a scientific discovery, concept, or phenomenon.
Then we'll take a dive into the complex and misleading world of pseudoscience to sort the factual from the fabricated.
I'm Matt McCabe.
And I'm Levi Bateman.
And this is IdioFacto.
Well, this is good. Starting to get back into the swing of it again. I've had a research day.
I know, yeah, and I was actually prepared for this episode, which...
That's good. Were you not last time?
No, I was prepared last time, but I got out of the habit of preparing for the podcast. How about that?
Oh, yeah.
And now I'm back in the habit.
Yeah. I kind of forgot how much I enjoyed it, to be honest.
I kind of forgot how much work there was involved.
Yeah, that's true. More so for you with the editing.
Yes, but that's okay, because I also like it.
Oh, well, good. Because it's your job.
Well, I don't get paid for it, so...
Maybe one day. How about that? You know what, listeners? If you share us around and you rate us and you subscribe and you tell your friends and everything like we've been bloody asking you to do for the last 6 months or so, maybe one day it can actually be our jobs. And imagine how good the content will be if we don't have to go to work and we can just record IdioFacto just all day long.
How many episodes do you think that we need to record?
Well, I don't know. We could record one every day if it was our job.
Daily IdioFactos. I think we'd almost run out of we've got a list of topics to cover. The list goes on forever, but we'd have to get super specific.
It'd get so specific. It'd be like, this week we're explaining how a copper sump plug works on a 1976 Holden Kingswood.
That is quite specific, yeah. And I would have to do a fair bit of research to tell you anything about that one.
I'm thinking about how broad something like space travel is. Maybe if we run through everything, that's our only option.
Well, speaking of broad topics, today...
Good segue.
No, we don't want to learn about segues, Levi.
Oh, maybe one day, though.
Actually, the way that segues work is pretty interesting. But don't get me started on that, because I'm talking about something else today.
What is it?
In medicine, a major issue when it comes to diagnoses is the inability for us to look inside the human body without physically opening it up and having a look inside, right?
Yeah. You could count the amount of places on a human body that you could actually see inside the human body on one hand, couldn't you?
Yeah. And even then, you can't see much of it.
No.
So short of an exploratory surgery, we need tools like X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, and those have become invaluable for diagnosis of various diseases. So one in particular that I find particularly interesting is MRI. Have you ever had an MRI?
No, luckily I never have. I've had quite a few X-rays, but no, I never had an MRI.
So I had an MRI the other day.
Ooh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, nothing drastic, and I'm all good, no worries. But it was an interesting experience, and it got me interested in finding out more about MRI. So,
where was the MRI?
On my head.
On your head? Well, I can tell you there's something wrong with your head, mate.
I
need to look inside it. It's written all over it.
Oh. Very funny. Well, according to the MRI, nothing is wrong with my head, so...
Yeah, well, that's because they were looking inside it.
Right, I see what you're saying, yeah.
Anyway, go on.
MRI stands for Magnetic Resonance Imaging. So it used to be called NMRI, where the N stood for nuclear.
Wow.
But the N is mostly dropped now to avoid negative connotations.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so sad. I was thinking about this before, that anybody that produces anything has to cater to the world of the idiot consumer.
Well, I mean, it's kind of unnecessary, really, to call it nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, because we'll get into it a bit later, but the nuclear just refers to the nucleus of the hydrogen atoms in the body. Magnetic resonance imaging is just as good, and yeah, most people aren't scared of MRI if there's no nuclear involved, even though it's got nothing to do with nuclear power or nuclear weapons or anything like that. Anyway, I do understand what you're saying, but I don't have a huge problem with them dropping the nuclear part.
The thing that made me think about it, I'll just mention why I said it and why it's fresh in my brain, is that I was brushing my teeth this morning and I remembered a documentary that I watched once on, well, it wasn't really a documentary, it was a short video on how toothpaste is made. And the red, green and blue or whatever it is, usually blue and red or something, the striped colours that you see, usually on the outside of the packet, it says, you know, it's got a red stripe and it says healthy gums, and then it's got a blue stripe and it says fresh breath or something. Those colours they don't have any special ingredients in them. They're put in there to make consumers think that that particular part of the toothpaste is doing something different to the rest of the toothpaste. And I think it's so sad that toothpaste manufacturers can't just make good toothpaste. They've got to make it... Anyway, this is all a massive digression.
But, like, advertising is a huge branch of psychology.
Yeah.
And one of the best funded branches of psychology as well, because obviously it's in corporations' best interest to understand the psychology of how advertising works.
Yeah.
So if anyone is interested in advertising, I highly recommend watching what is now called Gruen. It used to be called the Gruen Transfer on the ABC if you're in Australia.
Excellent.
It's such a good show, and it's all about marketing and that sort of stuff. Like, there's so many tricks like that you don't even realize are happening, but it works. So they do it.
That's right. Yeah, you sort of become blind to it because we're exposed to it so much, but it works on us. I mean, it works. I'm sure it works on me.
Well, Phoebe and I were driving home from Queensland a couple of weeks ago, and there was a sign on the side of the road advertising half-price books at a bookstore that was just off the highway. So naturally,
of course,
I couldn't help myself. And then I realised that I was being manipulated by advertising.
You sucker.
And I felt a little bit sillier. Didn't stop me from spending money on all of the books.
Oh, well.
Anyway, MRI.
Oh, yeah.
Back on track. Who said we were getting back into the swing of things?
No, that was wrong.
So MRI was proposed and developed by Dr. Raymond Damadian. Dr. Raymond Damadian.
Keep trying, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. Dr. Raymond Damadian. I wrote it down, but then I never said it out loud. I think it's Dr. Raymond Damadian from the State University of New York, and it was developed in the early 1970s as a way of detecting cancers using a somewhat flawed method, Dr. Damadian. It was eventually proved to be ineffective for cancer diagnosis, his method of using MRI. He's credited by many sources, including himself, as the inventor of MRI, though in truth it was a number of doctors in the early 1970s working on the basic principles proposed by Dr. Damadian that developed over a number of years a way of generating clinically useful pictures from an MRI machine.
Well, that's still cool because although he got it wrong, he sort of was on the way to getting it right. A bit like Da Vinci's helicopter, you know?
Yeah, true, but the potential for this sort of imaging had been around since the 40s. It was just not really ever implemented effectively in a clinically useful way. So in August 1980, the first full-body MRI scanner was used to obtain the very first clinically useful pictures of a patient's chest, and it identified tumours in the chest, liver and bones. That machine was then transferred to a hospital, and it was actually used until 1993.
Wow.
13 years is a huge amount of time for a machine, especially the first of its kind, to be used in that capacity.
Yeah, it must have been designed pretty well, just thinking about the amount of advancements that must have taken place within that period too.
Yeah, or the lack of advancement.
Maybe.
So the basics of MRI technology, it's incredibly complicated. Far more complicated than I expected, even though I expected it to be pretty complicated, but it's way worse than I was expecting.
Yeah, right.
In technical terms, the nucleus of a hydrogen atom can be induced to absorb and emit energy at radio frequencies when they're exposed to strong external magnetic fields. But in basic terms, there's a lot of hydrogen in your body, mostly in water and fat, and it can produce a radio signal when there are strong magnets around.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it's because water and fat are polar molecules.
Okay.
So they've got a positive end and a negative end. When you switch on a magnetic field, they all point in one direction. And then when you switch off the magnetic field, they all go back to like their relaxed state. So they're all in random directions. And then you turn on the magnetic field, they all align in one direction, and then you turn it off and they go back to their relaxed state. And then you turn the magnet on and that goes on and on and on. And the speed at which they relax and the speed at which they align is different based on what sort of material they're in. So if they're in fat, they align differently and relax differently to if they're in a tumor to if they're in a hematoma or something like that. So with the right detection equipment, a computer can essentially map the location of water and fat in the body and the size of the structure and all that sort of stuff. Basically what happens when you go to have an MRI, the patient is inserted into the MRI scanner, which is basically just a long hollow tube that's thermally insulated, and it contains really powerful electromagnets. So how powerful? A small bar magnet has an electric field that measures about 0.1 Tesla.
Is it the measurement of...
Magnetic fields are measured in Tesla.
That's so cool.
So a bar magnet is about 0.1 Tesla, and most MRI scans are operated at about 1.5 Tesla. So it's about 150 times more powerful than a bar magnet.
Oh, wow.
And about 50,000 times more powerful than the Earth's magnetic field.
I've seen some awesome demonstrations of this. I don't know if you were going to talk about it, but videos of a chair being tied, a rope around the chair, and then that rope tied to the wall or some piece of heavy equipment, and then the MRI machine being turned on and the chair sort of being like sucked towards the opening of the MRI.
Yeah, well, if you had a magnet that could operate at 1.5 Tesla on the end of a crane, you could pick up a car.
Yeah, right.
It's a pretty powerful magnet. Basically, you get put in between this hugely powerful magnetic field. So that's a bit unnerving. But it is completely harmless, as we will find out. The technology that goes into an MRI machine is pretty advanced because the magnetic field has to be strong and it has to be uniform. And then from that uniform state, there are other magnets that are used to oscillate or pulse at a certain resonance frequency, which makes the magnetic field sort of move and change, which in turn changes the direction of the polar molecules in the body and changes how they spin. And then a radio frequency detector can tell a computer basically what it's made from.
This is incredible. I'm just thinking about what goes into designing a machine like this, because it's not obviously a doctor or a health professional couldn't design a machine like this because they don't know about machines. They know about the body and they know about what makes up a cancer or a fat or a hematoma or anything, but they don't know how to make a machine. And an engineer or a mechanical engineer couldn't make this machine because they don't know what it actually needs to do. They don't know which frequency it needs to be at to speak to these water and fat molecules. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so this is what I hinted at when I said that this is a big topic. At the beginning, is that it's not one discipline of science that goes into building a machine like this. You've got medical doctors, physicists, engineers, all working together, usually at a university and usually funded by pharmaceutical companies or other medical societies, sometimes governments, sometimes the university themselves. It's about bringing the expertise all to one place and working towards a certain goal. So like you said, it actually requires a lot of knowledge from a lot of different disciplines. So you've got a really strong magnetic field that's pulsed at certain frequencies, and then you've got a detector that can pick up those frequencies and transfer them to a computer, which can then produce these diagrams so that a diagnostician can tell what's what. So the different sequences of oscillation results in different types of images. For example, and for our purposes, you don't need to know what a T1 weighted sequence or a T2 weighted sequence or a proton weighted sequence actually is. But for example, a T1 weighted sequence gives a low signal for tumours and inflammation than it does for grey or white matter in the brain. And a T2 weighted sequence does the opposite. So with a T1 sequence, you'd get like black spots among a sea of grey in the brain. And for a T2, you'd get really bright spots among a sea of grey.
Right, so I guess it depends on what you're looking for. You'd have to kind of know what you're searching for.
Yeah, you do, and MRI technicians are trained to look for those certain things. But they use a combination of those sequences to try and determine the size, the location, and the consistency of anything anomalous. So there are many advantages of MRI over other more traditional diagnostic methods. It's completely painless and completely non-invasive. You usually don't need to be injected with anything.
But you sometimes can be though, right?
You can. It does improve the picture occasionally, but you'll only be injected if the technician can't see what's actually happening.
And it's like a radioactive dye or something, isn't it?
It is, which sounds scary, but it's not at all.
Right.
It's completely harmless. So even like at its most invasive, it's an injection. So unlike CT scans or X-rays, MRI uses non-ionizing radiation in the form of radio waves and a magnetic field to produce its images. And so there's therefore no risk of mutations like cancer.
Wow, so it's safer than getting an X-ray?
Yes, much. Yeah. So with X-rays and CT's just basically a whole bunch of X-rays at one time. There is a risk that you can do damage to your DNA. And Sam talked about this a little bit, and I talked about this. There's two types of radiation, ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. And MRI uses radio waves. So basically the stuff that TV's broadcast by, that radio is broadcast by, that, is all around us at all times, Wi-Fi, all that. That's all non-ionizing radiation, and it's not harmful in the slightest.
Excellent.
So it sounds great, but it does have some disadvantages. Firstly, there's the noise. There is a whole range of noises that an MRI machine makes, and they can be extremely loud. Some of them can reach 120 decibels, which is the equivalent of a jet engine taking off.
Whoa.
Yeah. So it's necessary to wear hearing protection in and around the MRI machine when it's actually scanning.
Where does the noise come from?
So the main magnet that produces the magnetic field is stationary, but then there are 3 other magnets that move around and change the way that the magnetic field behaves. And because they're really powerful magnets and they're really heavy and strategically placed and they need to move really fast, it requires the machinery around them and the magnets themselves to move really rapidly. So there's a variety of weird sounds, some of which sound like whirring, some of them sound like banging.
Wow.
This is just a minute-long selection of the kind of sounds that you can hear in an MRI scan. And this is what really got me interested in it to start with. That was, even though I had hearing protection on and the technician actually let me listen to the radio through those headphones, I could still hear these really clearly. Obviously, they're so loud. And there was such a variety of sounds that I thought, what is actually going on and why is it so loud? But it's a byproduct of the heavy machinery and the power of the magnets that it uses. So here, have a listen to some of these.
That is insane. Yeah, I had no idea that's what they sounded like.
Yeah, so that's a variety of sounds. And that's only a selection of them as well. And they go on for minutes at a time.
Wow.
Yeah. Weird, hey?
Yeah, that's amazing. There's a couple of sounds in there. One of the sounds was like a tattoo gun. Another sound was like dial-up internet.
Yeah.
Sounded like almost some like bird calls in there too.
Yeah, when you're actually in the machine and you can hear those sounds going off, it's not disconcerting because I expected it to be weird sounds, but it just made me wonder what on earth is going on. But it just happens to be the way that they pulse.
Right.
Really interesting. And it has to be of a certain frequency, so there's no way around the noises, really.
Yeah, right.
So, more disadvantages. The extremely strong magnetic field, as you mentioned before, that it could pick up a car and it'll basically rip any metallic object straight to the magnet. So it can turn any loose ferromagnetic objects into projectiles.
That's really scary. Earrings and...
Well, yeah, it can result in any metal present in and under the skin being ripped out.
What about like a pacemaker or someone with a titanium rod in their leg?
Yeah. Titanium generally is safe for MRI, but pacemakers and aneurysm clips and things like that, foreign bodies like shrapnel in soldiers, all of those can't go anywhere near an MRI machine. So great care is taken to remove any metallic objects before entering the room. Like I had to take my jeans off and put on a gown because of the zipper in the jeans and the button. And if you have a pacemaker that has any metal on it at all, you can't get an MRI unless you get the pacemaker removed, which you obviously wouldn't want to do that. So, and also if you're likely to have any foreign metallic objects like a fragment of bullet or shrapnel, you wouldn't be able to get an MRI.
Yeah, right. That's really scary.
Another disadvantage is the claustrophobia. Because it's just a big long tunnel. If you're getting a head MRI, it's not too bad because you can just have your head basically put in the tunnel, but it's still a bit disconcerting. If you're having a chest MRI, your chest has to be in the middle of the machine, which means you have to be basically completely enclosed within the tube, which would be, even for someone like me who's not that claustrophobic, it wouldn't be very pleasant.
I'm thinking like maybe even children.
Well, children are often anaesthetized because it would be really overwhelming for them.
Yeah.
Sometimes the hospitals try and pretend that it's like a spaceship, or they encourage the kids to pretend that it's a spaceship. And you can imagine with those sorts of sounds that would be not a bad thing to, but I don't think I've met a child who would be okay with the whole experience. It's very overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if you don't quite understand what's going on. Also for adults, sometimes particularly claustrophobic adults can get mirrored glasses that have like you can lie down and look into the mirror and you can see your feet out the tube. So it's quite a persuasive illusion that you're not stuck in a tube.
Right.
But you can still see, like your periphery you would still be able to see the tube and everything, but it's just, apparently it's quite persuasive. So that's pretty much it for the disadvantages, but the major one that is talked about in medical circles is that the demand for MRI has inexorably risen since the 1980s, and many medical societies recommend against its overuse due to concerns about overdiagnosis. So we may have to get Sam on to talk about overdiagnosis as a concept maybe later this season because it's fraught with difficulties, but in basic terms, overdiagnosis is the diagnosis of a disease, in inverted commas, that will likely never cause symptoms or death during the patient's lifetime, or their regularly expected lifetime anyway.
Oh.
It's a big concept in medicine. It's not discussed as often as it should be discussed, but say you're 75 and you have heart issues and you get an MRI on your chest and they find a tumour on your lungs. But it's a relatively small tumour and it's benign. It's not going to spread anywhere, but you may then be almost obliged to seek treatment for the lung tumour, even though it's not actually going to affect you within the next 20 years. And by that stage, you'll most likely be dead from the heart disease anyway. It's a fraught concept, and I think to do it justice, we'll need to get Sam on to talk about it.
Because even if we get it and we find this benign tumour that you're talking about, that's still no big deal. It doesn't mean that we need to get treatment. Like I still think that's up to the health professional to realise what's worth treating and what isn't.
Well, that's exactly right. But it's a difficult concept to discuss without having any expertise in it at all. So
okay.
I think we should get Sam on to talk about it.
Cool.
So it can also be quite expensive, but the cost has fallen pretty dramatically, and it's now similar to the cost of a CT scan. So in most cases, an MRI is preferred where there's no diagnostic difference between a CT and an MRI because it's safer and it's about the same price. So if performed correctly, magnetic resonance imaging is a powerful and remarkably safe diagnostic tool with almost no appreciable disadvantages. An MRI scanner itself is an incredibly interesting, complicated and reliable machine that speaks to the ingenuity of humanity and our ability to apply basic concepts in science to many fields that seem completely unrelated. Like microwaves and MRI scanners use very similar technologies but are completely unrelated. And I think that's just pretty amazing.
Go humans. Well, thank you for running me through that, because that's amazing and it's blown my mind, and it's made me realise how much work would have been involved in getting an MRI up and running, and the different fields of engineering and science that have all had to come together to create this amazing machine.
Yeah, I know. I thought that while I was researching, this, like, the fact that we even discovered that things like this can help us and how they can help us is just mind-blowing to me. It all seems like it's too good to be true, almost.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things that's a little bit futuristic. If you'd told people, we'll say 80 years ago, that there was going to be a machine one day that would allow you to look inside human beings and paint a picture essentially of what's going on inside them, that'd be so far from believable. Well, the next part of the show is normally on a pseudoscience, and that's sort of how we run it. This week, though, it's kind of a bit of a mix, just because, for a couple of reasons really, I have to talk about something quite real and scientific and true to get my point across, I suppose. So you're going to learn a little bit about the science and the medical side of it, and then we're going to talk about the credulity behind some aspects of it as well. So this week I'm talking about non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And the first thing that I discovered was that celiac is spelt different in Australia and America, which confused the hell out of me when I first started. So for some reason, the Australian or English version of celiac is spelt C-O-E-L-I-A-C.
I imagine that's got to do with the coelom, which is a structure in the digestive tract.
Yeah, I guess so. And Americans have essentially made the word phonetic and taken out the O.
They've done that with a lot of things, though. Gotten rid of extraneous letters.
They drop out the U in a lot of words that are typically OU.
I have a hard time criticising them for that because it is unnecessary, really.
Yeah, I'm happy with simplifying the English language as much as we can, really.
The only thing that I like about spelling is that it gives you hints into the etymology of words.
That's right.
Apart from that, simplify it all the way.
Another thing about English that frustrates me is the fact that phonetic is spelt with a PH. Anyway, what a nerd. Let's talk about some non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or NCGS as I might call it. I don't know. We'll see.
I just have a thing related to the phonetics and stuff. I saw a thing on Facebook where you replace all of the vowels in your name with oodle, which would make me moodle thoodle woo. And it would make you Loodle voodle. So I'm Moodle Thoodle Woo and you're Loodle Voodle.
Oh, why have you done this to me? I'm going to do this with every word I ever read now.
Yeah.
The word gluten is gloodle toodlin'.
Anyway,
so
sorry.
Silly.
Very silly. Very funny though. Anyway, tell us about gloodle toodlin'.
Well, I'm probably not going to get too technical about what celiac disease is, but I'll have to talk about it just because we're talking about non-celiac gluten sensitivity, so I'll skim over it on my way to the topic that I'm kind of more going to focus on, this NCGS. So first of all, what is gluten? Well, predictably, I suppose it's a protein, and it's made up of two different molecules, glutenin and gliadin, and they basically are responsible for this elastic, they form like an elastic kind of bond when water is added. Well, the word gluten actually comes from the Latin word for glue. So you'd know when you mix water with flour and you end up with this kind of sticky, flexible substance, that's the gluten that's doing that to the flour. So bakers can actually add more gluten, just pure gluten, to different products. And, if you want to make a shape that needs a dough to be particularly flexible and sticky, you can add gluten to it.
So that's why gluten-free muffins just fall apart when you eat them.
Oh, yeah. A lot of gluten-free food does. And I've tried some myself, and there was one of the videos that I watched in doing the research for this, there was a lady who was a dietitian and nutritionist, and she said that 15, 20 years ago, when gluten-free food started to be made, her and her colleagues used to have a joke about whether or not it was better to eat the gluten-free food or the box that it came in, because they essentially tasted the same. And gluten-free bread, for example, you couldn't make a sandwich out of it. It had to be toasted, and even then, it still pretty much fell apart.
I bought a muffin one day, and the lady behind the counter said, "Oh, this one's actually gluten-free, is that okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess so. It probably just tastes like a muffin." And then I went to eat it, and it was really dry, and it fell apart, and it kind of just tasted like ground up cardboard.
Yeah.
So I feel sorry for people with celiac disease.
So when you break down wheat and you analyse its chemical components, we see this gluten, which is gliadin and glutenin, but we also see other proteins like albumins, globulins, and amylase trypsin inhibitors. We also see a type of starch like fructans, and I'll get into this later, but fructans is actually a type of food that's classified as a FODMAP, which, as I'll explain later, which is why a proper medical diagnosis is so important. But we'll start more simply and talk about some of the foods that you'll find gluten in, and it's basically anything that contains wheat and other grains like barley, rye, and oats. And there are some other grains that are clones or very closely related to wheat that you'll find gluten in. Most of these things, you think about the amount of stuff that wheat is put into, like pasta, bread, beer. There's a lot of your carbohydrates that we eat in a day-to-day diet all come from wheat. So what is celiac disease? It's an autoimmune disease, and a lot of people might have heard of it, an autoimmune disease affecting the digestive tract. So as gluten passes through the small bowel, it causes an inflammatory reaction, which inflames and shortens the villi lining of the small intestine. So if you've ever seen a close-up of villi, which is a structure inside the human body, it's microscopic, and it exists in a lot of different surfaces, really, doesn't it? There's villi in your gut, there's villi in your lungs. It's basically like these very, very small, if you zoom up on them, they look like little fingers that poke out, and it's to increase the surface area to volume ratio, essentially. So this inflammation causes the villi to enlarge and compress against each other, and essentially you're losing all of that surface area. So this can affect the absorption of nutrients. And continuing to eat gluten, if you've got celiac disease, can actually cause some really serious damage to the villi, and in some cases permanent gut injury and even death. So for a celiac person to continue eating a lot of gluten, in really serious cases, it can actually be fatal. So it's super important for them to get their diagnosis right and make sure that their diet is what they should be eating. So some of the symptoms of celiac disease are unusual stools, often weight loss or struggling to gain weight because you just can't absorb these nutrients, abdominal pain, bloating, mouth ulcers. You might also experience certain dietary deficiencies, which is also linked to not being able to absorb these nutrients. Some dermatitis type conditions, growth failure and delayed puberty, and even pregnancy complications. So to get tested for celiac disease, there's a few different ways that you can do it, but generally a bit of blood work and gene testing can actually confirm your genetic predisposition. This has got a fairly high accuracy. It can't actually tell you definitively whether or not you have celiac disease, but it can give you a pretty good idea of your genetic predisposition. There's also several scopes. You can have an endoscopy or a colonoscopy, and this can be used to visually identify inflamed gastrointestinal tissues. Biops can be taken.
Biops. You can take
biops.
A biopsy.
So biopsies can also be taken where they take a small piece of the lining of the gastrointestinal tract and they analyse it under a microscope. An exclusion diet can also work. So you actually can't be tested for celiac disease if you've been on a gluten-free diet to try and combat your celiac disease, as the symptoms will have lessened or disappeared. So you need to be consuming, for someone that's given it up because it causes all of these horrible symptoms, the thought of eating gluten again is probably pretty scary. But you need to do it, and the only treatment is actually a lifelong gluten-free diet. So that's celiac disease in a nutshell. Now we'll run through non-coeliac gluten sensitivity. So this was the part where my views kind of got challenged a little bit, because I was actually always under the impression that there was no such thing as non-coeliac gluten intolerance. I always thought that it was, we won't say made up, but it was going to be something else that was causing
exaggerated?
it. Yeah, I suppose exaggerated. There's not all that much that's known about it currently, but it is a condition where people will experience these similar gastrointestinal symptoms, but often without the, or almost always without the deadly or lifelong damage to the system.
Sounds a lot like IBS to me.
Yeah, it is very similar to IBS, and often the two are confused, or often you can have non-coeliac gluten sensitivity and IBS. The IBS is caused by the NCGS, so...
Okay, well, tell me about non-coeliac gluten sensitivity, because I have always been under the impression, I did an assignment on it back in like the first or second year of uni. It was a literature review, and I had to do basically what we do in the podcast and go through the available literature and make a judgment on just kind of summarize the literature, just pretty much exactly what we do on the podcast. And the conclusion that I came to was that most of the research is funded by and performed by the gluten-free industry.
Right.
And it's not a medically accepted diagnosis. But admittedly, that was probably getting close to 10 years now.
That was going to be my next question, is when was it? Because obviously, as I'm going to speak about, it's becoming increasingly popular.
Yeah, well, it was at the time as well. So
okay.
It was becoming increasingly popular as a self-diagnosis at the time.
Right. And you've touched on probably the major point that I want to try and get across, but I'll run you through it. So, as I said, it's sort of becoming increasingly popular for people to claim that they are gluten intolerant, and that the gluten-free diet is also something that's becoming very popular. I mean, most cafes and restaurants now have gluten-free options, and there are actually entire food shops and restaurants dedicated to being gluten-free, which is fantastic if you're celiac.
Well, especially because 30 years ago, it was almost impossible to find gluten-free things.
That's right, yeah. So if you were celiac, you just needed to avoid anything that would have contained... There was no substitute, if you know what I mean. There was no gluten-free bread or gluten-free pasta or anything like that. So I watched this documentary on the ABC on gluten, and in that documentary they were actually at a gluten-free convention in Melbourne, a whole convention and hundreds of stalls dedicated to this gluten-free industry. So there's massive money tied up in it, which doesn't surprise me when you say that you found a lot of studies that were funded by the gluten-free industry. There's a couple of reasons why somebody might go gluten-free, and the first is obvious, and it's because they think that they have non-coeliac gluten sensitivity. But, and I want to stress this, unless they've been diagnosed, it could actually be a heap of other things. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. There's another couple of reasons, though. It's a bit of a trend, and it's becoming kind of almost cool to be gluten intolerant and to eat gluten-free foods. And possibly the reason for this is because people think that it's healthier. I watched a presentation where there was a dietitian that spoke about the reasoning behind this, and she said that she thinks it's because anything that's, in inverted commas, free of something, it must be healthier. So we've got foods that are salt-free, fat-free, sugar-free, and all of these are, supposedly healthier. And then you see gluten-free, so you assume, it doesn't have any gluten in it, it must be healthier. It sort of all fits in the same box. And that and gluten-free products can often be found in the health food aisle. So it's only natural for people to assume that they're a healthy option. But are they healthier? Well, actually not at all. And often when gluten is removed from a particular product, and we spoke about this before with the muffin or whatever falling apart, something else must be put into its place to reproduce the gluten effect, or that glue on the food. And this is usually sugars or fats or oils and other fillers. So in this ABC documentary, they compared a few different products. And the example that I'll give is pancake mixture. So they had a pancake mixture that contained gluten, just normal flour. And then they had a pancake mixture that was gluten-free pancake mixture. And in 100 grams of the gluten pancake mixture, the normal stuff, there was 800 kilojoules. And in the gluten-free pancake mixture, there was 1,400 kilojoules. So nearly double the amount of energy. And I guess it's because of this added sugar and fat and other ingredients to fill that gluten role. And some of the doctors and dietitians in this doco actually said that they had patients that would come to them that had tried to lose weight on a gluten-free diet, but had actually put on weight. So it's actually not healthier if you aren't a celiac.
Well, if you just take that pancake mix, for example, if you and your partner one was eating the gluten-free mix and the other one was eating the regular mix, and you made the same number of pancakes and you ate the same number of pancakes, then you'd be getting like 1.75 times the amount of kilojoules, exactly, the amount of energy than your partner would be getting.
Yeah. Yeah. So to get around this, often like you look at a gluten-free loaf of bread, it's pretty small. And
right.
So the servings are usually smaller to combat this extra energy intake.
Right.
So this is probably the most important section of what I'm going to talk about, and it's the diagnosis of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So there's no genetic test. NCGS won't show up in a scope. So, a camera, you can't physically see it like you can with celiac disease. And a biopsy won't give you any clues as to whether or not you have it. So basically you have to go through the process of being tested for celiac disease. And once that's excluded, you have to go through an exclusion diet to ensure that it is not, in fact, a FODMAP diet that you require. So certain components in wheat also cause allergic reactions in people requiring a FODMAP diet, like this fructan like that I spoke about earlier on. It's a type of starch. So there's no way of knowing unless you've done this exclusion diet for a totally different illness. And the other thing is avoiding gluten-containing foods if you don't have this non-celiac gluten sensitivity can actually have negative health effects. According to another presentation that I watched by Pamela Kewerton, who's a dietitian and nutritionist, she said that if you don't eat it, you're missing out on a high source of dietary fibre and B complex. And she also said that wheat-based foods contain fructan-type resistant starches that can actually aid in healthy gut bacteria. So like with a lot of things, if you're cutting out a certain type of food, you need to make sure that you're getting what you're missing out on, getting it elsewhere. It's a bit like if you go vegetarian, for example, it's not enough to simply stop eating meat. You sort of need to work out how to substitute those amino acids and proteins and things like that.
And that's where supplements would actually be helpful.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. As Sam covered in that episode, that's sort of the only time when you should be using supplements is when you have a health reason to use them and you've been diagnosed with something that would mean that you should be using that particular supplement. Or
if you have particular dietary requirements that preclude you from eating meat, for example, like vegetarianism, for example, and you took
iron supplements or fish oil even. Fish oil, which was the example that Sam used. So, yeah, there's certain times when, supplements are entirely necessary and should be prescribed. So, it's still a bit tricky. The research is still not entirely clear, and there have been some in vitro and animal studies, but we've discussed this before, and as we've said, this is not always transferable to the human body, but one possible mode of action that's been postulated is the effect of gluten on epithelial permeability and possible leaky gut. But as I say, it's still not entirely clear, and I will post a link to some of these articles that I read, but none of them were entirely conclusive, will we say. Part of me went into this research believing that there was no such thing as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but it's not really the case. And like any good skeptic, my opinion was actually instantly changed once I found evidence for it. However, I still have an issue with non-celiac gluten sensitivity from a credulity or, we'll say, bandwagon point of view. As I've discussed here with NCGS, and as we've talked about on the show before with supplements, it's actually pointless and potentially dangerous to diagnose yourself with any disease. And in the case of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, there are actually other conditions that could be causing your discomfort, and unnecessarily abandoning gluten altogether can actually cause you to miss out on several beneficial features of gluten and gluten-containing foods.
And more importantly, not actually address the issues that you're facing.
Exactly.
So, say, for example, if you had diverticulosis and just diagnosed yourself with non-celiac gluten sensitivity and stop eating gluten, you're not going to fix your diverticulosis. It's not a thing that you can fix by not eating gluten.
Yeah, exactly. And that's probably the main problem that I have with it is, as I mentioned the word bandwagon before, and I think there's this common misconception that gluten is unhealthy for everybody, whereas that's really not the case at all. And another funny sort of argument that I heard one of the doctors use was the fact that he said humans, in terms of human history, it's only very, very recently that we've actually even been consuming gluten. So our bodies don't have the ability to digest it properly, which is true. But the same argument could be made with any of the thousands of artificial chemicals that are made in laboratories, and very few of these have an allergic type effect on the human body. So just because the human body hasn't been consuming something for generations and generations doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically going to be bad for us.
Yeah, I've always drawn parallels between self-diagnosed non-celiac gluten sensitivity and self-diagnosed lactose intolerance. Because similar arguments are made for both, and people quite often self-diagnose themselves with lactose intolerance as well. And for similar reasons to what you're talking about, that's not always the root of the problem, but the same argument is made for that. Like we haven't, it's only been fairly recently that we've been consuming products with lactose, and therefore our bodies aren't able to process it. But that's demonstrably untrue. There are millions of people who consume lactose products every day without issue.
Yeah, exactly. We can have allergic reactions to a number of things that humans have been consuming for literally millennia.
Yeah, humans have been stung by bees for millennia, and yet some people still have allergic reactions to bee stings. So
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the big point about this, and it's probably almost a dual name for the episode. I mean, I've chosen non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but I also could have just called this episode self-diagnosis. Because I think that's the biggest thing, is that I am pretty sure, I don't have the statistics on this, but I'm just going to go out on a limb, and please correct me if I'm wrong, to say the majority of people who claim to be gluten-free haven't been through the process of eliminating celiac disease, exclusion diet to eliminate FODMAP, and then working your way through several other gut irritation allergens. I think people just know, in inverted commas, that gluten is unhealthy and then remove it from their diet.
Well, the other thing that happens when you cut gluten out of your diet is you're a lot more particular about the types of foods that you eat.
Yeah.
So just that in itself can be enough to subdue any symptoms. So, for example, if you try and cut gluten out of your diet and start eating more vegetables and you feel better afterwards, it might be because you're eating more vegetables. It might have had nothing to do with the gluten. You're just eating better.
You're also not eating anything that contains oats, wheat. You're not eating bread. You're not eating pasta. You're not having toast. So, there's probably a reason why you're losing weight. It depends, though. I guess another reason to not enter a gluten-free diet, unless you've been diagnosed with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, is because it's usually higher in calories due to the additives. So if you stop eating gluten-containing bread but start eating gluten-free bread, and the same with pasta, chances are you're going to put on weight. As with anything to do with your body, it's best to not diagnose yourself unless you're a doctor, as your self-diagnosis is most likely wrong, and you could be missing out on the opportunity to be properly diagnosed with another, more realistic illness.
That's it for this episode of IdioFacto. Forward all suggestions, hate mail, evidence and arguments to idiofacto@gmail.com.
And you can reach us on gluten-free Facebook, gluten-free Instagram, gluten-free Twitter, and all of the other gluten-free platforms at IdioFacto. And the gluten-free links are in the show notes.
I think what you mean is the shootaloo noodle toodlies.
Why? Why have you done this to me?
Links are in the shootaloo noodle toodlies.
That's the only way that I'm going to read any word from now on.
Thanks for your help this episode, Ludovoodle.
No worries. Methoodle hoodaloo. Wait,
no, it's
Moodle
Foodaloo.
That's so silly.
We should do the I'm Moodled McOodle Boodle.
And I'm Loodle Voodle Boodle Toodle Moodlin.
And this is Oodle Doodle Oodle Foodle Goodle Toodle.
Oh, God, that's ridiculous.
Oh, okay, let's stop recording now.